Let me ask you something before we dive in. Have you ever been punished for doing the right thing? Not just a slap on the wrist, not a neighbor's disapproving glance, but punished so brutally that it left you questioning whether the world had lost its mind. That's exactly what happened to me. And trust me, once you hear how my homeowners association, yes, the HOA, slapped me with a 50,000 fine for hoarding water, you'll understand why I had no choice but to take nature's side in the battle. It all started with the drought. Summers had grown longer, harsher, and crueler in our little community. The lawns once green and lush had faded to brittle yellow, and the sound of sprinklers, once an evening ritual in suburbia, had been banned altogether. Families struggled. Gardens shriveled. Kids ran through dust instead of grass. But at the edge of our neighborhood, where my property stretched toward a sloping ravine, something miraculous existed, a natural spring. When I bought my home, I thought of that spring as little more than a trickle. Beautiful to watch, calming to hear, but over the years, I realized its potential. With a few weekends of work, some pipes, and an old damming technique my grandfather had taught me, I built a modest pond. Nothing fancy, nothing grandiose. Just enough to collect water, store it, and share it with my parched garden. It wasn't about profit, it was about preservation. And in a drought it felt like a gift from the earth itself. At first, my neighbors admired it. Kids would toss pebbles into the pond, and mothers would comment how refreshing it looked compared to their dusty backyards. But then, as months turned into years, the HOA came knocking. They didn't come with gratitude. They didn't come with questions. They came with paperwork, stiff suits, and words that made my stomach sink. "Mr. Carter," they said, "you're in violation of community guidelines. You're hoarding water." I laughed at first, because what else can you do when someone accuses you of hoarding something that comes from the ground, something no human could own? But their faces were stone. They weren't joking. They had rules, bylaws, legal jargon that twisted common sense into something grotesque. And then the hammer fell. The letter was crisp, printed in bold black ink, with one number screaming at me from the page 50,000. The words blurred in my vision. 50,000. For water that wasn't bottled, wasn't sold, wasn't stolen. Water that simply bubbled up from the earth, pooled, and nourished life. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at that paper as my wife, Emily, tried to steady my shaking hands. "They can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not right. This is our land, our spring." But the HOA had lawyers. They had bylaws. And they had the kind of arrogance that makes ordinary people believe they can strip nature down to contracts and clauses. For weeks, I felt like a criminal in my own home. Every time I walked outside, I could feel eyes on me. Neighbors who once smiled now whispering. Some pitied me. Others, I think, envied the water I had and wished it were theirs. The worst part wasn't the fine, though. It was the feeling of helplessness. That somehow, the gift my grandfather once told me to cherish had become a burden heavy enough to break me. I could sell the house, drain the pond, bow my head in defeat. That's what the HOA wanted. That's what their fine demanded. But deep down, as I stood at the water's edge, I realized something important. This spring wasn't just mine. It was never mine. It belonged to the earth, to the deer that drank from it, to the wildflowers that bloomed around it, to the insects buzzing in its reeds. And that's when the seed of defiance planted itself in me, because if they thought they could put a price tag on nature, then maybe it was time to show them what happens when nature stops being contained. I didn't know it yet, but that decision, the choice to fight back not with lawyers or money, but with the force of the earth itself, would change everything. And that's where the real story begins. The morning after the fine, I woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, suffocating sort that comes before a storm. Emily was still asleep beside me, but I couldn't rest. The number, 50,000, kept burning in my mind like a brand. I padded outside barefoot, the ground cool against my feet, and walked down to the pond. The water was still. The surface mirrored the pale dawn, pink and gold. For a moment, I thought about giving in, draining the pond, dismantling the dam, letting the HOA win. It would be easier. Cheaper. Maybe. That's what they counted on, people folding under pressure. But as I stood there, a deer emerged from the woods. She bent her head, sipping from the spring-fed pond. Behind her, 2 fawns appeared, shaky-legged, cautious but trusting. Their reflection shimmered in the water, and something inside me broke. Not from despair, but from clarity. This water didn't belong to me. It didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to life itself. If they wanted to label it hoarding, then maybe it was time to release what they feared most. Not compliance. Not surrender. But freedom. That evening, Emily found me in the shed, covered in sweat and mud, working on the dam. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tense. "Letting it go," I answered simply. Her brow furrowed. "You mean the pond?" I nodded. "If they think I'm hoarding water, then I'll show them what happens when water runs wild. They can't find nature, Emily. They can't chain a river." She hesitated, torn between fear and admiration. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Do it, but do it for the right reason." That night, under the cover of darkness, I loosened the stones and timbers that had held back the spring for years. My hands trembled as I pulled the final support away. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan and a sudden rush, the pond gave way. The water roared forward, spilling down the ravine, carving its own path with ferocity and grace. It was terrifying and beautiful, like watching freedom itself take shape. The ground trembled under my feet as nature reclaimed its voice. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with commotion. People gathered along the streets, pointing, whispering. The ravine that once sat silent now carried a steady stream. It snaked through the community, weaving past yards, feeding patches of brittle earth. Wildflowers perked up as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Birds swooped low, drawn to the glittering thread of water. And yet, the HOA came knocking again. 3 board members stood at my porch, their polished shoes muddy from following the stream. Their faces were twisted in disbelief and rage. "Mr. Carter, what have you done?" one demanded. I met their eyes calmly. "I stopped hoarding, just like you asked." Their lips parted, but no words came. For once, their contracts and bylaws meant nothing. They couldn't fine a river. They couldn't punish wild deer or thirsty soil. They had no jurisdiction over freedom. In the weeks that followed, something incredible happened. What began as outrage turned into awe. Neighbors who once whispered began to gather by the stream, dipping their hands into the cool water. Children skipped stones across its surface. Gardens revived. People started planting again, laughing again, living again. Some even thanked me quietly, their voices low so the HOA wouldn't hear. But I saw the change in their eyes, a spark of hope. The HOA still tried. Letters arrived, threats written in cold, black ink. But they couldn't stop what had already been set free. Lawyers argued, but judges looked at the case with bafflement. How do you fine a man for a river he no longer controls? Emily and I watched as life returned to the neighborhood, not because of rules, not because of policies, but because of a choice to honor the earth. One evening, I sat by the edge of the stream, the sound of rushing water filling the air, when a neighbor approached. It was Mrs. Harper, an older woman whose garden had withered years before. She carried a small basket of fresh vegetables, vibrant and green. "These grew again," she said softly, placing the basket beside me. "Because of the water." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Thank you." I didn't know what to say. The weight of that gratitude was heavier than any fine. As summer stretched on, the stream became more than water. It became a symbol. A reminder that nature, when freed, provides for all. People began calling it Carter's Creek. Though I never claimed it. It wasn't mine. It never had been. And in the quiet moments, when the HOA's letters sat unopened on my desk, and the sound of children's laughter drifted on the breeze, I realized something profound. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. Not give up, not surrender, but release. Release control, release fear, release the chains others try to place on you. The $50 in fine never truly disappeared. On paper, it still exists, but it no longer matters, because money can't measure the worth of life, of growth, of freedom. So when people ask me now, why did you do it? Why take that risk? I tell them the truth. Because water isn't meant to be owned. Because nature isn't meant to be caged. And because sometimes the only way to win against those who try to control everything is to remind them that some things will always be wild. The stream still runs today, and every time I hear its steady voice, I remember the night I let the dam fall, the night I chose to let the earth speak louder than any fine, louder than any rule. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. When the world tries to put a price tag on what's sacred, when they tell you to bow to rules that defy common sense, don't be afraid to stand with nature, to stand with truth, to stand with freedom. Because no matter how heavy the hand of control may feel, water will always find a way. And so can you.